You directed prosecutors gutting enforcement against corporate criminals and public corruption.
You're talking about public corruption to me? Whoa.
Which should be repealed to illegally send people to a torture prison in El Salvador.
Representative Robert Garcia delivered a blistering condemnation of Attorney General Pam Bondi, calling her one of the worst attorneys general in our history, and demanding her immediate resignation. Garcia systematically detailed Bondi's cover-up of the Epstein files, protection of ICE agents who murdered constituents, persecution of protesters, and gutting of corporate crime enforcement, noting even Trump has repeatedly called her weak and ineffective.
Thank you, Chairman. Attorney General Bondi, glad you finally made it here after hiding for 4 months from this committee. I understand why you're hiding from us.
Chairman?
You're one of the worst attorney generals in our history and an instrument of Donald Trump's lawless authoritarian agenda. And I'm glad the American people are seeing who you are, how you act, and the lack of good values. You weaponize the Department of Justice to target immigrants, working families, and anyone that Trump deems an enemy of the state, all to protect real powerful criminals, including in your administration. My Democratic colleagues have focused on your cover-up of the Epstein files and your passion for protecting pedophiles and child traffickers. That alone is grounds for impeachment. But there's so much more to your corrupt tenure as Attorney General. You directed prosecutors to investigate elected officials in welcoming jurisdictions, and you got thrown out of court when you sued Chicago, Cook County, and Illinois. You directed prosecutors to prioritize low-level immigration cases while gutting enforcement against corporate criminals and public corruption. You revived draconian
You're
law
talking
of
about public corruption to me?
1798,
Whoa.
which should be repealed to illegally send people to a torture prison in El Salvador. You fired over 100 immigration judges, including the assistant chief immigration judge in Chicago, without cause, and installed unqualified military judges whom you instructed to deny asylum in violation of the law. You prosecute the president's enemies like Jim Comey and Tish James while giving impunity to federal agents who are murdering and brutalizing and terrorizing constituents, including in Chicagoland, in my neighborhood. I saw it last year firsthand. You and Kash Patel covered up the murder of Silverio Villegas Gonzalez in my district by ICE agents. You tried to investigate Renee Good instead of the ICE agent who murdered her, and you tried to cover up the murder of Alex Peretti by CBP agents. You bring fake charges against protesters like the Broadview Six and Marimar Martinez, whom your administration labeled a domestic terrorist. This is the Montessori teacher who lives in my district, while protecting thugs who terrorize us and DHS authority. That's what you do. Protect and enable the criminals who are plundering our society and destroying what's left of democracy and the rule of law. Epstein accomplices, mass DHS thugs, corporate criminals, Tom Homan, Eric Adams, insurrectionists, the list goes on. And you talk about fighting crime, but you protect any criminal who helps you and Trump turn our country into an authoritarian gangster state. And after all this, nobody supports you. I'm not talking about Democrats. I'm talking about conservative judges who are condemning the rampant lawlessness at DOJ under your leadership. Your prosecutors are quitting in droves over being forced to prosecute low-level immigration cases, including in Chicagoland. Your MAGA base despises you because you're covering up the Epstein file. How ironic. And even your own boss has repeatedly complained to your staff about you, calling you weak and ineffective. Weak and ineffective. That's what Donald Trump thinks of you already. You will not win, however. Chicagoland rejects you. The American people reject you. Our communities have demonstrated our strength and resilience in the face of cruelty and cowardice. Democrats must impeach and remove lawless officials like you and Kristi Noem and impose accountability for every criminal action. But you can spare yourself more humiliation. Resign now and submit yourself to accountability by the American people. Mr. Chairman, before I yield back, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record this Wall Street Journal article dated January 12, 2026, entitled, "Trump has complained about Pam Bondi repeatedly to aides." Thank you, and I yield back.
Representative Garcia began by noting Bondi had hidden from the committee for 4 months, understanding why. The American people were finally seeing who she is, how she acts, and her lack of values. He identified her as an instrument of Trump's lawless, authoritarian agenda who weaponizes the Department of Justice to target immigrants, working families, and anyone Trump deems an enemy while protecting real, powerful criminals within the administration. The Epstein cover-up, Garcia noted, was grounds for impeachment alone. Bondi's passion for protecting pedophiles and child traffickers was not rhetoric, but an accurate description of her refusal to investigate Epstein's clients, her protection of administration officials with Epstein ties, and her facilitation of Ghislaine Maxwell's transfer to minimum security. But as Garcia emphasized, there was so much more to her corrupt tenure. Garcia methodically documented constitutional and statutory violations. Bondi directed prosecutors to investigate elected officials in welcoming jurisdictions and got thrown out of court when she sued Chicago, Cook County, and Illinois. She directed prosecutors to prioritize low-level immigration cases while gutting enforcement against corporate criminals and public corruption, a complete inversion of prosecutorial priorities that protects the powerful while terrorizing the vulnerable. She revived draconian 1798 laws to illegally send people to a torture prison in El Salvador. She fired over 100 immigration judges, including the assistant chief immigration judge in Chicago, without cause, and installed unqualified military judges instructed to deny asylum in violation of the law. This was the systematic destruction of due process in immigration proceedings, replacing experienced jurists with military personnel willing to rubber-stamp deportations regardless of legal merit. Garcia then detailed specific murders covered up by Bondi and FBI Director Kash Patel. They covered up the murder of Silvius Gonzalez in Garcia's district by ICE agents. They tried to investigate Renee Good instead of the ICE agent who murdered her. They tried to cover up the murder of Alex Preddy by CBP agents. This pattern reveals a deliberate policy. When federal agents kill citizens, investigate the victims and their families rather than the killers. Meanwhile, Bondi brought fake charges against protesters like the Broadview Six and Marimar Martinez, a Montessori teacher whom the administration labeled a domestic terrorist, while protecting the masked DHS thugs who actually terrorize communities. This inversion, treating peaceful protesters as terrorists while protecting actual violent federal agents, perfectly captures the administration's priorities. Garcia's list of protected criminals was devastating. Epstein accomplices, masked DHS thugs, corporate criminals, Tom Homan, Eric Adams, January 6th insurrectionists. These are individuals who should face prosecution, but instead receive protection because they helped Trump and Bondi turn the country into an authoritarian gangster state. Most damning was Garcia's observation that nobody supports Bondi. Conservative judges are condemning the rampant lawlessness of the DOJ under her leadership. Prosecutors are quitting in droves over being forced to prosecute low-level immigration cases. The MAGA base despises her for covering up the Epstein files, and even Trump has repeatedly complained to staff about her, calling her weak and ineffective. This last point, documented in a Wall Street Journal article Garcia submitted for the record, reveals the ultimate indignity. Bondi has compromised every principle, violated countless laws, covered up murders and sex trafficking, destroyed institutional independence, and gutted enforcement against powerful criminals, all to serve Trump. And Trump assesses that she's weak and ineffective. She has sold her soul and received nothing in return but contempt. Garcia's final appeal was direct. Bondi could spare herself more humiliation by resigning now and submitting to accountability by the American people. This was not mercy, but a recognition that continued service would only compound her disgrace.